Today's first guest is Jeremy Watson. Jeremy is a performance poet who is reflecting on childhood trauma and the toll it takes to find freedom and healing in adulthood in his new STLFringe FEST 24 production of The Complicated Reflections of Him, A Poetic Journey. Jeremy, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
I'm so glad that you're here.
I'm glad to be here.
As an artist, how did you find your way to poetry?
I don't know. I don't know how I found my way to poetry. I think when I was a child, I was a singer. In my own head, I could sing and I loved to write songs. And I think that was just a natural progression between being a singer, writing songs, and then poetry. So I think I got an introduction into poetry by way of music. And I've been writing poetry for as long as I can remember. Literally, till this day, have books of hundreds upon hundreds of poetry that I've written as a child. So I don't know if that was how I was introduced, but it had to be by way of music.
Wonderful. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Cross disciplines.
Yes.
So when you think about poetry and the complicated reflections of him that you're going to be performing at the festival, what as an audience member or watcher can I expect when I sit down to see this show?
My testimony, my truth, the things that I went through as a child. First of all, The Complicated Reflections of Him is my sixth book, is comprised of 44 poems that tell of our testimonies, if I may, that talk about the trauma from my childhood, but also talks about the trauma that other men who shared their stories with me, and really allowed me the creative freedom to discuss their truths and their testimonies as well. What I want people to get from this show and understand from this show is that we have all gone through things, and we don't have to be stuck in those things. So that's really what I want people to grab from this show, is that we can go through trauma, but we don't have to live in that trauma. There is freedom and healing that's available to us.
That's really beautiful. It's because it's said that poetry can be created as a deeper form of self-reflection, right? When I was doing research, that theme kept coming up. Can you discuss your personal creative process in making this piece and poetry in general?
For this one, it was fairly easy, believe it or not. I had a truth, I had a testimony that I wanted to relay, and the process for me was just pretty much writing out what I wanted to say and what I wanted to convey to the audience. And then I would take my creative mind or my visionary and able to then dissect it to art, if that makes sense. Yeah. I wanted to just relay I just wanted to let my heart pour naturally. And after I wrote it all out, what I really wanted to say, then I began to dissect it into poetry. So it was an interesting process because it's not something that I talk about. A lot of the things in the book, whether it's molestation, whether it is sex addiction. One of the stories is about having a parent that both parents are drug addicts. These are truths that most men are not comfortable talking about.
Sure.
So I wanted to really give an authentic voice to each of those stories and tell that truth as poetically as possible, but really as authentically as I possibly could. And I hope I conveyed that, and I hope that you'll see that in this show.
Can you give us a few lines?
One of my defining pieces in this book is a poem called Scream. And it is a poem that talks about being molested as a child. And the first part of that says, the first part of that poem says, if I may, it only took a moment for me to be trapped within the memories I'm sure he'd revisit. It's a truth that I wanted to tell, but I knew he would never admit to it. He wrote me into a chapter of his story while soiling the pages of my entire book. With a permanent marker, each sentence of him bled into every subject, and no eraser took. And that's just me painting that picture of what that looked like for a kid. And in that poem, I go into more of an adult, being an adult, dealing with a lot of that struggle. There's a part in that poem, too, that says, scream from the inside. When the pressure that's meant to break a boy's heart was applied, pick up the pieces, Jeremy. Well, yes, I tried, but each piece is scattered inside, and it does not come with a guide, at least one that instructs a man with a broken heart where a broken boy abides. So again, going through the emotions and the years and years of dealing with trauma and not knowing how to deal with it as a man, and getting to that point of freedom where at the last verse says that when I brought my pain to his throne, my scream, it took on a different tone. I no longer had to be the harvest from the seeds another man had sown, and I made this known. I'm no longer your prey. Sometimes the worst part about being victimized as a child is renewing the part of your mind that still believes you are a victim today. Again, going through that childhood, going through the adult that did not understand what all of this stuff was, and then finally becoming that man that understands his freedom and how to distribute all of that stuff that I didn't have to own for the rest of my life.
It's very powerful.
Thank you so much.
It's very powerful.
Thank you so much.
The complicated reflections of him. The question I'm asking all the artists on today's podcast is, as a fringe work maker, we're always, thinking about shows, developing work, writing poetry, and occasionally we get stuck. If you're going to give advice to somebody out there who has something to say, something as important and valuable and powerful like your piece, but they're stuck, what is your advice to get unstuck?
It's to write it out. It's understanding the message that you want to convey. And I think that sometimes when we get stuck, it's because we want to paint it pretty. Sometimes you just have to write it ugly and then worry about prettying it up some other time, or just present it ugly. Sometimes our truths are ugly. Sometimes they're messy. Sometimes sometimes you're so used to being quiet about it. Sometimes you just have to let your heart pour out and let it be as it is.
Jeremy Watson, that's beautiful advice.
Thank you so
Let
much.
it be ugly. Absolutely. The Complications of Him is at STLFringe FEST 24 this year. You can find Showtimes tickets, festival passes for the complicated reflections of him and the entire lineup at stlfringe.org. Thank you, sir.
My pleasure. Thank you.